Last season, Alex Carrier played in 73 games for the Montreal Canadiens. He scored 7 goals. He finished with 22 points. He was a +2 and blocked 155 shots. And if you look at those numbers alone, you probably come away thinking he had a pretty solid season. Nothing spectacular, but reliable and useful, maybe even a little bit underappreciated. But then you watch the games. You watch what happens when he's not around the front of the Canadiens' net. You watch Carrier leave his position to chase a puck carrier who's already covered along the boards. And then you watch two Canadiens defenders end up on the same side of the ice to only see the opposing forwards establish body position in front of the net. And then the puck's in their net. Suddenly the numbers don't tell the entire story, do they? Because Alex Carrier's 2025-26 season wasn't necessarily a statistical disaster, but there were real problems in his defensive process. Problems that became increasingly difficult to ignore. And problems that Montreal has to address before deciding what Carrier's role is going to be moving forward. Because this simply isn't about whether Carrier is a good player. We know that he is. It's about whether or not the Canadiens are asking him to do something that he simply isn't. So let's talk some puck. Before we continue our assessment on Canadiens defensemen, which started on Thursday with Xhekaj, we need to take a little bit of time to look at some news that came up today in Montreal. And the first one, of course, is that Daniel Jaocb got named the coach of the Laval Rocket, the Canadiens' AHL affiliate. No real surprise to anybody. He's been in and out of the organization for the last 15 years. He's worked in the American Hockey League with both the Laval Rocket and the San Diego Gulls. So a lot of experience. Kind of a no-brainer. But the only thing I'm hoping here is that the Montreal Canadiens might mentor him a little bit with somebody that has a little bit of NHL experience. Because the NHL experience that Pascal Vincent had really helped developing some of the players that were ready to join Montreal last season. So I want to see how that plays out. But at the end of the day, the Canadiens got their man. Jaocb is the new head coach of the Laval Rocket. And we move on. And we hope that he does well, because if he does well, the Canadiens do well. Next, we had the announcement that July 30th would be the date for arbitration between Kirby and the Montreal Canadiens. Now, of course, we know the whole saga. The Canadiens tendered a two-way deal for $4.1 million as a qualifying offer. Kirby doesn't want to be sent down to the minors or even let that door open, so he filed for player-elected arbitration. The Canadiens are hoping that the amount of games that he missed will bring down his $4.1 million number, while Kirby hopes that he just gets a one-way deal at that same $4 million number. So we'll see what happens. Either way, this is just two organizations, whether you talk about Kirby representation or the Canadiens themselves, taking care of business the way they're supposed to take care of it and the way they're allowed to take care of it. So nothing really too crazy to announce here. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this whole notion that came up today about the Canadiens fielding calls for Xhekaj. Now, this came from Marco D'Amico and Dave Pagnotta. And listen, for all of you out there, don't read anything into this, because it happens with every GM, including that of the Montreal Canadiens, every single year. The same way you guys have been frustrated in terms of Kent Hughes making calls to other teams around the league and not being able to make trades, well, guess what? The Canadiens field the same calls like that on players that other teams look up and down the lineup and say, hey, we have a whole year. I don't have another cap space. Who do I have available in the league that might be able to fit that bill? So you've got calls on Xhekaj. I'm sure they've received calls on other players as well. At the end of the day, it's nothing more than standard practice by NHL GMs since the time the salary cap came in 2005, 2006. So don't get your panties in a bunch. Xhekaj is not getting traded, and he still has to sign his entry-level deal before the 15th of July. That would be the big news if he really doesn't sign it. We'll see what happens, but at the end of the day, the Canadiens still hold his rights, so we'll leave it at that. Now let's get to having an honest conversation about Alex Carrier. And no, this isn't me bashing another Quebec-born player, which I got accused of when I was talking about Zach Bolduc the other day. This isn't any kind of emotional conversation, and not a conversation where I'm going to blame him for every goal against the Montreal Canadiens. And it's not going to be a conversation where I pretend that he has absolutely no value. Alex Carrier is a legitimate NHL defenseman. He moves relatively well. He blocks shots. He makes a good first pass. plays the right side, kills penalties, and he's willing to put his body in front of the puck. Those are all very valuable qualities. But being useful and being dependable in a top four defensive role are a couple of completely different things. Carrier's traditional statistics suggest that his season was just fine. His underlying numbers were generally close to the break-even point. At 5-on-5, the Canadiens controlled approximately 49% of the expected goals with Carrier on the ice. His actual goal share was slightly above 50%. Those numbers aren't catastrophic. They don't describe a defenseman getting destroyed every night, but they also don't measure every coverage error. They don't tell us when he abandoned the front of the net. They don't tell us when he lost inside positioning. And they don't always identify the player who created the breakdown before the shot was taken. That's where video becomes really important for every team in the National Hockey League. But let's begin on the positive side. Carrier finished the season with 7 goals and 15 assists. That's giving him 22 points in 73 games. He averaged just over 19 minutes per night, and he was a +2 along with 155 shots that showed he was willing to sacrifice his body when he needed to. Those are all respectable totals, especially for a defenseman who receives almost no power play time. Carrier is not being paid to be the quarterback on the first unit, and he's not expected to produce like Lane Hudson. He's supposed to provide a little bit of stability, move the puck efficiently, defend, kill penalties, and complement Montreal's more offensively aggressive defensemen. But even the offensive numbers require some kind of context. When you look at Carrier, he scored 7 goals on only 56 shots this year. That's a 12.5% shooting percentage, my friend. In 2024-25, he scored 3 goals in 79 games, and that was good for just below 4%. So Carrier didn't suddenly become a significantly more dangerous offensive player. He just finishes opportunities at an unusually high rate. Carrier generated approximately 2.9 individual expected goals during the season. He scored 7. That's excellent finishing, but it's probably not something that's overly sustainable for him. The 7 goals made the season feel a little bit more productive than it was, but it didn't necessarily reflect a major improvement in terms of his overall offensive impact. His scoring rate also declined slightly compared to the first 51 games that he played with the Canadiens. After arriving from Nashville in 2024-25, Carrier recorded 18 points in 51 games. That's 0.35 points per game. This last season, he produced 22 points in 73 games, and that was good for 0.3 points per game. Not a dramatic decline, but it's another reason why we shouldn't look at the 7 goals and assume Carrier suddenly made a meaningful step forward offensively. Now, Carrier did block 155 shots. That's extremely impressive, and there's no reason to dismiss it. Shot blocking is an art form, as Guy Carbonneau taught us. It requires timing, courage, positioning, and a willingness to accept physical punishment. Martin St. Louis described Carrier as a warrior, and that reputation is understandable. But block shots are sometimes, they can become one of the most misleading defensive statistics out there. A block shot tells us what happened at the end of a defensive sequence. They don't always tell us how we actually got there. Did the defenseman maintain a positive gap? Did he stop the zone entry? Did he protect the middle? Did he close a passing lane off? Win a battle before the opposition established possession? Or did the defensive structure break down and forcing somebody to jump in front of a puck and take a bullet for his teammate? Blocking the shot still is valuable, but prevention is even better. The best defensive sequence isn't always the one that ends up in a heroic block. Sometimes it's a sequence where the opponent never reaches the dangerous area that becomes more important. Carrier's block total remained almost identical on a per game basis. That is, he had 169 blocks in 79 games in 2024-25 and 155 in 73 games last season. But his recorded hits, well, they dropped from 75 to just 35. Now, hits aren't a perfect defensive measurement, right? Different arenas record them very much differently. And chasing hits can create their own positional problems, as we well know. But a decline of that size supports what many people saw on the ice. Carrier wasn't consistently eliminating bodies in the defensive zone. Too often, he was defending with just his stick. Too often, he was arriving beside the opposition forward instead of establishing position first. And that becomes a major problem at the net front. Now, defending the front of the net isn't simply about being a big guy either. Carrier is listed at 5'11" and 174 pounds. He's never, and I mean never, going to overpower some of the larger NHL forwards that are out there. But size isn't the only part of net front defending. Your first responsibility is positioning. You have to establish the inside lane and keep yourself between the attacker and the goal. You have to control the other player's stick, and you have to make sure that the player can't move freely enough to get to the crease. Carey struggled with all those details too frequently last season. There were situations where he was standing beside the opposing forward instead of being between him and the net. There were situations where the attacker established position first and Carey was just forced to reach around him and take a stick penalty for hooking. And there were situations where the puck arrived in the crease, but Carrier had no leverage to prevent a rebound opportunity. When you're a smaller defenseman, and assistant coach Stefan Robio would know this, you can't afford to arrive late. You can't afford to give up the inside, and you can't rely exclusively on the stick positioning. You have to engage early. You have to control the opponent's route, and you have to make sure the net front feels a hell of a lot more uncomfortable than it is. That doesn't mean cross-checking players, and it doesn't mean taking penalties. It means using your hips, your shoulders, your feet, and your positioning, along with some tools that some very wily defensemen normally teach their stewards. Putting your stick under a person's ass and lifting to get them on their tiptoes, putting it inside their pants and pushing down to make them lean backwards. All those lovely little things we learned as children. Carey is willing to block a shot. Nobody's going to question his courage to do that. The question is whether he consistently controls the play that's standing beside him. And too often during the season, the answer to that was no. Now, the next thing is going to be the biggest concern in Carey's defensive game. There's a very distinct difference between pressure and unnecessary pursuit. There's a difference between helping your partner out and duplicating your partner's assignment. Too often, Carey left the most dangerous area in the defensive zone to chase a puck carrier that was already being covered by his teammate. His partner would have the opponent contained near the boards, and Carrier would say, screw this. Screw you guys, I'm going home. And he'd go over to the corner, and he'd try to get near the puck and try to help out. Now, both defensemen are on the same side of the ice. Both defenders are looking at the same player, and nobody is positioned to protect the front of the net. That's not aggressive defense, that's duplicate coverage. When the strong side defenseman is already engaged on the puck carrier, the other defenseman usually has to protect the front of the net. It's that simple. He has to identify the most dangerous uncovered player. He needs to make sure that the pass doesn't go into the slot, and he needs to be ready for the backdoor option. Carey sometimes abandoned that responsibility a little bit too early. He followed the puck, and instead of reading the formation, he got himself into a whole heap of trouble. And once he moved towards the boards, Montreal's defensive structure became completely vulnerable. The opposing forwards didn't have to beat two defenders now. They only had to move the puck once. A short pass, a little cycle, a reverse behind the net, and suddenly the Canadiens had two players trapped outside the most dangerous part of the ice. And Carey's coverage issues became noticeable enough during the season that there was a public discussion about whether or not he should be removed from the lineup so that he could see what was going on from upstairs and give him a better perspective. You know, that type of play where you abandon the front of the net, it can completely destroy an entire defensive possession. And it's something that Carrier needs to get out of his game. Now, this is where defensive analytics and analysis becomes a little bit more complicated. When Carrier and his partner are on the ice for a goal, both players receive the same minus. They both receive the same on-ice goals against result, and they both are affected by the same shot attempt. But they may not share equal responsibility for the breakdown. Maybe Carrier abandoned the front of the net. Maybe his partner failed to communicate a switch. Maybe the center didn't collapse low enough, or the winger missed his assignment. Hockey is a totally connected game. Defensive mistakes rarely occur in isolation. And that's why we can't take an expected goal percentage and treat it as a complete defensive evaluation. Carey spent approximately 270 minutes in his most used pairing with Mike Matheson. That pairing finished +3 in its shared minutes. On the surface, that looks functional, but a shared result can't tell us which defender made the first mistake. It can't tell us whether Matheson recovered after Carrier left his assignment, and it can't tell us whether Matheson had given away the puck, and it can't tell us whether the goaltender prevented a coverage error by making some kind of a big save. It certainly can't tell you whether a forward rotated down to cover the player Carrier left either. The numbers describe the final result. The video explains the process, though, and Carrier's process wasn't consistently there, and it wasn't dependable. That doesn't make the analytics useless, but they all require context, and that's what we talk about when we talk about the eye test. That's your context. Carey's near break-even expected goal numbers tell us that Montreal wasn't overwhelming during every shift that he played. The video tells us that there were specific defensive habits that created unnecessary danger. Both those things can be true at the same time. And that brings us to the real question. Is Alex Carey a bad defenseman? No. Is he a legitimate shutdown defenseman? That's a bit more difficult to defend. Carey can support a pairing. He can move the puck, block shots, kill penalties, and because he's a right side shooter, he fills a position that every NHL team values. But when Montreal uses him against heavy forechecking teams or asks him to control powerful forwards around the crease, his limitations become a little bit more visible. He's not physically dominant. He doesn't consistently clear the front of the net, and his tendency is to over-pursue, which can pull the entire defensive structure out of whack. That makes him better suited in a complementary role, maybe bottom six. A player who can support the stronger defensive partner, a player who can receive manageable matchups, and who can contribute on the penalty kill, but not necessarily the player you want carrying the defensive responsibilities of a top four shutdown pairing. Carey has one season left on his contract, carrying a $3.75 million cap hit. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent last season unless he re-signs with the Montreal Canadiens. Now, that means Montreal has a very important decision to make. Do they extend him? Do they allow the contract to expire? Do they use him as a trade asset, or do they retain him but reduce the expectation attached to his role? The answer should depend on the price and on the role. Carey at a reasonable number, playing controlled minutes in a balanced third pairing, that can provide value. Carey receiving a significant extension while being treated as a long-term top four defensive solution, that would be a lot more concerning to me. Now, Carey's season wasn't terrible, but it wasn't as reassuring as the traditional numbers would suggest. Wow, I can't speak anymore. The 7 goals helped, but they were helped out by an unusually high shooting percentage. Block shots reflected effort and courage, but they didn't erase the breakdowns that happened before the shot even came. His overall on-ice numbers were acceptable, but acceptable results can still contain questionable defensive habits. The real issue was not one individual mistake. It was the repetition, leaving the front of the net, following the puck carrier who was already covered, allowing both the defensemen to be occupied by the same player, losing inside position, and relying on the stick after the opposing forward had already established leverage. Those are all correctable problems. And Carey is an experienced defenseman. He understands defensive structure. He should be able to improve on those particular details, but Montreal still needs to hold him accountable. Veterans can't receive a different standard simply because they can block shots. If a young defenseman repeatedly abandons his assignment, we know that he loses minutes. Xhekaj. He may lose his place in the lineup. Xhekaj. And that same accountability has to apply to Carey, regardless of whether or not he's a veteran. The Canadiens don't necessarily need to remove him from the roster, but they need to defend him properly or define him properly. Alex Carey is a very useful NHL defenseman, but he's not automatically a shutdown guy. He's not automatically a long-term top four answer, and he has respectable statistics, but they shouldn't prevent Montreal from confronting the weakness in his defensive game. Because when you're trying to build a team capable of winning in the playoffs, you can't evaluate defense only by counting points and block shots. You have to ask much more difficult questions. When the puck reaches the most dangerous parts of the ice, can you trust the player to be in the right place? With Alex Carey, that trust was tested a little bit too often. So now I don't want to know what you think. Did Alex Carey's offensive production and block shot totals hide a disappointing defensive season? Can Montreal still trust him inside his top four? Or is he better suited in a third pair role moving forward? And with Carey entering the final year of his contract, should the Canadiens extend him, trade him, or let the season play out before making a final decision? Let me know in the comments. And remember, being willing to defend is the same thing as defending correctly. I'm Coach K. This is PuckTalk Montreal. Remember to like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, and keep your skates down and stick on the ice. Go Habs, go.